think, going to be closer to what Sir Henry Morgan's men were eating in Panama. And I repeat, please do not try this at home. So first, I cut up a few pieces of the leather and then soaked them in water for about a half an hour. Then I took them out and pounded them for a good 10 minutes with a mortar and pestle. And then I repeated this 5 or 6 times. And I tested some I just left to soak for like 6 hours, and some I would pound and then soak and pound and then soak. And just the soaking basically did nothing. So the pounding is actually what is going to soften this up. Now the book says that then they put the leather onto hot coals, and I don't have any hot coals, but I do have a source of heat that I put it right on, and immediately it began to smoke, and again, not great. Not as bad as this leather, but not great. So I decided that I would boil it, because that's actually how it's often done in later descriptions. It's also how Charlie Chaplin prepared a shoe in the movie The Gold Rush, and he ate that whole thing, laces and all. Seemed to enjoy it as well. So I'm going to boil it for 30 minutes, which gives me time to ask myself, why am I doing this? And it turns out that the author of today's recipe gives me an answer. Some who were never out of their mother's kitchens may ask how these pirates could eat and digest these pieces of leather. Whom I answer, he who objects to eat this stuff never knew hunger as the buccaneers knew it. And I never have known hunger like the buccaneers knew it. So all I can do is look back at their situation. A situation so dire that they decided to luncheon on leather. Buccaneers of America, while somewhat sensationalized, is the founding text of our knowledge of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Not the ride, the actual pirates. And in it, Exquemelin tells us of the many great and dastardly deeds of Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan had become increasingly bold in his attacks on the Spanish, and in 1670 he gathered 1,200 men on 5 boats with cannons and 32 canoes with the goal of attacking the city of Panama, which at the time was the second largest city in the Americas. Unfortunately, due to a lack of rain, the rivers that they had planned to go up, that would take them almost all the way to Panama City, were running dry about halfway through the trip, and so they had to get out, abandon their boats, and make their way on foot. This was something Morgan did not want to do because it meant leaving behind many of their provisions. And so within just a few days of trekking through the jungle, the pirates were extremely desirous to meet any Spaniards or Indians hoping to fill their bellies with what provisions they could take from them. For now they were reduced almost to the very extremity of hunger. But the wily Spanish had sent out spies to watch Morgan, and so warned people as Morgan approached. And so the villagers fled, leaving nothing behind unless it were a small number of leather bags, all empty, and a few crumbs of bread scattered upon the ground where they had eaten. Being angry at this misfortune, the pirates pulled down a few little huts which the Spanish had made, and afterward fell to eating the leathern bags, as being desirous to afford something to the ferment of the stomachs, which now had grown so sharp that it did gnaw their very bowels. Thus they made a huge banquet upon those bags of leather. They marched on until they arrived at a place called Barbacoa, which, despite its name, did not afford them any barbecue. But they did discover a secluded little grotto, in the which they found 2 sacks of meal, wheat, and like things, with 2 great jars of wine, and certain fruits called plantanos. But for most of the next week, it was back to the leather and whatever other edible plants they might forage. Eventually, they did come across a storehouse that had some bread and wine, but they got sick after they ate and drank, so they actually thought it was poisoned. But the true reason was their huge want of sustenance and the manifold sorts of trash which they had eaten upon the voyage. And when they did finally get to the city of Panama, they were quite justifiably angry. And so instead of just the usual plundering of the city, they were brutal to the inhabitants, torturing and killing most of them, and eventually Morgan burned the entire city to the ground. This was the event that turned Henry Morgan from privateer to pirate, a man outside the law. Though when Exquemelin's book came out years